February 18, 2012. New Hope Baptist Church, Newark, New Jersey. Inside, the pews are filled with musicians, actors, and mourners who have traveled from across the country to say goodbye to Whitney Houston, dead at 48, found in a hotel bathtub 3 days earlier in circumstances that would take weeks to fully explain. Gospel singers who had known the Houston family for decades stand shoulder to shoulder with recording industry executives, all of them dressed in white per the family's request. A wall of light and color inside a modest brick church built for a congregation a fraction of this size. Outside, television crews line the street for blocks, and a crowd too large for the small church to hold stands quietly in the cold February air, waiting simply to be near the building where the voice they grew up on is being laid to rest. Somewhere away from the cameras, in a home not far from Detroit, a 70-year-old woman is watching the coverage on television, unable to attend in person, her own health too fragile that week to make the trip. She has known Whitney Houston since the day she was born. She held her as an infant, watched her grow up singing in the same churches, the same living rooms, the same tight circle of gospel families that had shaped generations of American soul music. She is Whitney's godmother, and on the day the world says goodbye to one of the greatest voices it has ever produced, she can only say goodbye from a distance, through a screen, carrying a grief that has nowhere public to go. Her name is Aretha Franklin, and the story of her bond with Whitney Houston did not begin with fame. It began, decades earlier, with two families who sang together long before either of their most famous daughters were born. Stop. To understand why Aretha Franklin became Whitney Houston's godmother, you have to go back to a corner of American gospel and soul music where a small handful of families kept crossing paths, generation after generation, long before either woman became a household name. Aretha Louise Franklin was born on March 25, 1942, and raised in Detroit in the home of her father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, one of the most influential black preachers in the country. Gospel royalty moved constantly through that house, and Aretha grew up surrounded by singers who would go on to shape American music for decades. Among the musicians who crossed paths with the Franklin family in those years was Cissy Houston, a formidable gospel and session vocalist in her own right, who sang backing vocals on recordings for a long list of major artists throughout the 1960s and 1970s, including on multiple occasions Aretha Franklin herself. The two women worked together in recording studios, sharing the kind of close professional intimacy that develops between artists who spend long hours perfecting harmonies meant to disappear seamlessly behind someone else's lead vocal. Cissy Houston's own family carried deep musical roots. Before her session career, she had sung as part of a respected gospel vocal group and later became a founding member of the Sweet Inspirations, a backing vocal group whose harmonies appeared on recordings by a remarkable range of major artists throughout the 1960s, lending professional, gospel-trained Polish to songs that would go on to define the era. Her family was connected by blood and friendship to some of the most important voices in American gospel and soul music, including her niece, the singer Dionne Warwick, whose own career had already made the extended Houston-Warwick family a quietly influential presence in the industry well before Whitney was born. When Cissy gave birth to a daughter on August 9, 1963, and named her Whitney, the child was born into a musical lineage so dense that greatness was less an aspiration than a kind of inheritance. The same way a family of carpenters might raise a child who simply grows up already knowing how to hold a hammer. Aretha Franklin, already a rising star in her own right and a close friend of the family through years of shared studio work and church circles, became the child's godmother, a relationship that carried real weight in the tight, faith-centered communities both families belonged to. It was not an honorary title extended for publicity, as sometimes happens between famous people. It reflected an actual ongoing closeness between two households that had been intertwined for years before either daughter ever stood in a recording studio of her own. Whitney Houston grew up, much like Aretha herself had a generation earlier, singing first in church, in her case the New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, where her mother served as choir director. By her teenage years, she was singing backup for her mother professionally and modeling on the side, already displaying a voice so technically Extraordinary that industry figures who heard her sing in small New Jersey clubs would later describe an almost immediate certainty that they were listening to someone who would become one of the defining vocalists of her generation. Stop again. Because what makes the bond between Aretha Franklin and Whitney Houston worth returning to decades later is not simply that one famous woman happened to know another. It is the specific, weighted meaning of what it means for one generation's defining voice to formally, publicly, and permanently vouch for the next. By the time Whitney signed her first recording contract with Arista Records in 1983 under producer Clive Davis, the same executive who had already helped rebuild Aretha Franklin's own career at the same label a few years earlier, the two women's professional worlds were already deeply intertwined. Whitney's self-titled 1985 debut album became one of the best-selling debut albums by a female artist in history, and by the time she released The Bodyguard soundtrack in 1992, featuring her generation-defining rendition of I Will Always Love You, she had become, by many measures, the single most commercially dominant vocalist in the world. Aretha Franklin watched this ascent with something that, by every available account, resembled genuine pride rather than the wary comparison older stars sometimes extend toward rising ones. In public appearances and interviews across the following decades, Aretha spoke warmly of Whitney's talent, describing her goddaughter's voice in terms of real admiration, understanding as few others could, exactly what it took to carry that kind of instrument through a career built almost entirely on public scrutiny. She had, after all, spent her own teenage years navigating a version of the same pressure, and there was a particular kind of recognition in the way she spoke about Whitney's gift, the recognition of one carrier of an extraordinary inheritance acknowledging another. The two performed at some of the same major events over the years, including tributes and award ceremonies where their paths crossed as two generations of the same unbroken vocal tradition, one having handed something forward to the other before either of them fully understood how heavy that inheritance would eventually become. There is a particular photograph taken at one such event in the early 1990s that has circulated widely in the years since both women's deaths. The two of them standing close together, Aretha's arm resting lightly across Whitney's shoulders, both women smiling in a way that looks less like a posed publicity moment and more like what it actually was. A genuine embrace between an elder and the young woman she had watched grow from an infant into one of the most celebrated vocalists on the planet. Whitney Houston's career, extraordinary as it was, also carried a well-documented and increasingly public struggle with substance abuse that played out across tabloid coverage, a reality television series, and her own candid public statements over the years. This account will not dwell on the details of that struggle beyond what has been documented in her own words and in coverage at the time. What matters here is that it was a struggle her godmother watched unfold from a position of genuine love and, by most accounts, genuine helplessness. The particular anguish of an elder in a tightly bound community, watching someone she had known since infancy fight something that fame and talent alone could not fix. On February 11, 2012, Whitney Houston was found dead in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Beverly Hills on the eve of the Grammy Awards. She was 48 years old. A coroner's report later determined that the causes contributing to her death included drowning, the effects of heart disease, and cocaine use. The news moved through the music industry and the wider public within hours, arriving with the particular shock reserved for a voice so many people had grown up believing was permanent. Aretha Franklin, by her own public statements at the time, was devastated. She had reportedly hoped to sing at the funeral, a gesture that would have carried enormous symbolic weight, one generation's defining voice sending off the next in the same church where Whitney had first learned to sing. Ultimately, due to her own declining health that week, she was unable to travel to Newark for the service. She issued a public statement instead, describing her grief and her long history with the Houston family, and watched, like millions of others, as the funeral was broadcast for the world to see. The absence was, in its own quiet way, one of the more painful footnotes to an already devastating loss. a reminder that even the most powerful voices in American music are not exempt from the ordinary limitations of age and illness when it matters most. Those close to both women have said, in interviews conducted in the years since, that Aretha carried real regret about being unable to attend in person, a regret that sat alongside rather than instead of the deeper grief of losing someone she had known and loved since the day she was born. In the years that followed, Aretha Franklin continued to speak of Whitney Houston with the specific tenderness reserved for family rather than colleagues, referring to her in interviews in the language of loss reserved for someone irreplaceable. She occasionally performed songs associated with Whitney in tribute settings, carrying forward, in her own way, the same instinct that had defined so much of her career, the belief that a voice, once given, belongs partly to whoever needs to hear it again. The broader arc of Aretha Franklin's own life continued for 6 more years after Whitney's death, carrying the same relentless combination of triumph and quiet endurance that had defined it from the beginning. She had already by then redefined Otis Redding's Respect into a civil rights and women's movement anthem in 1967, sung Precious Lord, Take My Hand at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral in 1968, recorded the best-selling live gospel album in history with Amazing Grace in 1972, rebuilt her career twice, at Arista Records in the 1980s, and again through decades of live performances afterward, delivered an unrehearsed Nessun Dorma at the 1998 Grammy Awards with only 20 minutes' notice, and in December 2015, brought a sitting president to tears at the Kennedy Center Honors performing A Natural Woman, a song written for her the same extraordinary year she recorded Respect. On August 16, 2018, Aretha Franklin died at her home in Detroit, surrounded by family. Following a private battle with pancreatic cancer, she had largely kept out of public view. Her funeral in Detroit stretched across nearly 8 hours, drawing tributes from musicians across generations, a homegoing worthy of a woman whose voice had, in one form or another, touched nearly every major chapter of American music for over half a century. What remains, beyond the recordings and the awards, is a quieter kind of legacy carried in the specific bond between 2 families and 2 extraordinary voices. Aretha Franklin did not simply admire Whitney Houston's talent from a professional distance. She was present for her goddaughter's earliest years, connected through her own working relationship with Cissy Houston, part of the same tight circle of gospel-rooted musical families that produce some of the most important voices in 20th century American music. When Whitney rose to a level of global fame that few artists in any era achieve, Aretha watched with pride rather than rivalry, understanding intimately what that particular kind of scrutiny costs a person, having lived under a version of it herself since she was a teenager. And when the worst happened, when the goddaughter she had known since infancy died decades before her own time should have come, Aretha Franklin carried a grief that was, by every account, deeply personal rather than merely professional, the grief of an elder watching a beloved young woman she had helped raise, in the loosest but most meaningful sense of that word, taken far too soon. 2 voices, 1 lineage, passed down through churches and studios and living rooms long before either woman ever stood in front of a microphone that mattered to anyone beyond their own family. Aretha Franklin gave the world Respect. Whitney Houston gave it I Will Always Love You. Neither song exists in isolation from the tradition that produced it, a tradition built, quite literally in this case, on the bonds between 2 families who understood, long before either daughter was famous, that a voice like that is never entirely one person's alone. It is inherited, nurtured, and eventually, if it is fortunate enough, passed forward to someone capable of carrying it further still. There is a particular kind of grief reserved for those who outlive the people they were supposed to protect, even when protection was never fully within their power to give. Aretha Franklin carried that grief for the final 6 years of her own life, alongside every other loss and triumph that had shaped her, a quiet undercurrent beneath the concerts and the honors and the ordinary business of continuing to be the queen of soul in public while, in private, missing a goddaughter she had known since the day she was born. She rarely spoke about it at length, and this account will not invent sentiments she never expressed. What she did offer, consistently, in the interviews where the subject came up, was the same simple, unadorned love she had shown Whitney from the very beginning. The recognition that some voices are given to a family before they are given to the world, and that watching one of them go silent too soon leaves a particular kind of silence that never fully fills back in.